This week on Cumulus on Cloud, we're going to talk microservices as a part of migrating to cloud. One of the big questions that people have when looking at taking their current applications and moving them into the cloud is whether or not they should rewrite them. Should we take our monolithic apps and break them up and write them in microservices? What are the benefits of doing that, really, is sort of the first real big question that comes up. And I think there are a number of ways of looking at this. If the application that you have is large and yet still needs to be resilient and still needs to be able to deal with the update kind of process that we really should be considering when we go into cloud. Again, just remember the security aspects that we have to keep in mind when we're running in a cloud environment. We have to make sure that we can update the underlying operating systems if we're dealing at that level, and the application components themselves if security vulnerabilities are found within the libraries and code that we're using. We really want to be able to update those systems much more frequently. So the first thing that we can think about is that microservice is the current buzz for application development, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right model for what we need to do. The real requirements, I think, can define a different approach to microservice applications, although it may also be that microservices, like taking your application and turning it into a microservice, is exactly the right thing to do. Where I think we can take the question is first looking at the application. What is the possibility of scaling that application up and down by adding and removing resources? How well is that application already designed to handle a single node failure? So if I have a multi-web front end or a system that's capable of having multiple web front end resources, can I remove one of them without impacting the overall application? Yes, I might break a connection. Yes, I might impact a single user for a second or while the user then has to retry their application. But as long as the application is designed to deal with that kind of impact to the system, it might be that microservices won't really buy you anything, at least up front. Now, one of the things that we can get out of the environment, and given that most applications, especially applications that can scale like that, have already done at least some application segmentation. Well, my data storage is already separate from my application itself. Yes, the application itself may be monolithic, but as long as it's monolithic with a shared data storage system and I can delete one of my monolithic elements, that's okay. That might be all I really need to run in the cloud, run at scale, and run efficiently. Now, looking at the process for deploying that application, this might be where the biggest changes start to come into play, because I want to start thinking about how I can deploy and update and potentially, if necessary, although there are other ways of doing this, but I might need to upgrade or downgrade a resource automatically. Can I do that? Can I at least model what that looks like? And it might be that any new development or update development efforts that are applied to the application are better applied at that kind of modeling, understanding how I can automate those upgrade processes, and getting your operations team to start building those sorts of automations into the system might be much more efficient and effective than getting into the microservices space. Now, where microservices start to make sense are where you have a really large, dense, complex application where individual components have been already shown to impact the overall performance of the application, or individual components, when they're changed, potentially impact the entire application because of the tight coupling of all of the resources, the data storage services, and the interactions with those services all in that one application. If I can start breaking out control functions into separate application components, I might find that I get a more efficient application development lifecycle, because I can start building new capabilities in as new API calls rather than as new interactions within the overall application, where the different teams have to work directly together to actually make those interactions happen. And that's where I think we get the biggest benefit of this microservice model. Each resource is its own service. Each resource can have its own development cycle, its own development team, and can actually be separated out of the impact of any of the other application development processes, because those teams will get, instead of having to work very closely to understand exactly how to communicate either with the application component itself or with with the newly updated backend storage resources, it's easier to talk directly to a RESTful API. And there are actually, today, I think, more developers that understand that model than the esoteric model of any one particular application's intertwined interactions. Classically, I think it was Jeff Bezos' quote. I wonder how much of this is now urban legend even, but his thing was that in their application, and realize at their scale, they're talking about the Amazon storefront. At that scale, breaking a number of those resources up into different applications made a lot of sense. Dealing with the catalog of books plus the catalog of book images plus the catalog of book prices plus the catalog of resources, etc. All those different catalog components, the shipping engine, etc. All those pieces had to talk to each other. And when built initially as a monolithic application, that never would have worked. But it was also still very possible for people to say, well, I might be the book front-end application and I'm going to talk to the book back-end database just by talking to the database rather than by going through effectively a database abstraction, a database service that provided the data that the book engine needed rather than providing access to the database directly. And that kind of segregation is what really, I think, differentiates a microservices mentality and a microservices development model from just an application that happens to have multiple moving parts. Again, depending on the complexity of the application, it might make sense to start breaking out services from your application as microservices, even in the process of moving from a private data center into the cloud. But in general, I think it's better to look at the application and determine if you can just cloudify it. Maybe the simple process of containerizing it and then running it in a container environment like Kubernetes is adequate for actually dealing with scale, update, potentially reversion if an update fails, sort of processes, better development processes, better continuous delivery of the underlying resources for that application are probably a better engineering effort up front than trying to take an application and turn it into a microservice from the very get-go. So that whole process is really sort of key. But there are other benefits to microservices, and that really comes down to some of the things that now come from containerization, even potentially more than microservices, because I can bundle together resources, and those resources can be somewhat separated from each other because they live within container bundles and they live behind an API. So just because I need to change how I talk to my database doesn't mean I need to change the rest of my application. Again, this is one of those microservice segregations. Also, I can start using different applications for different parts of my, or different application development models. So for example, maybe my web front end is more better written as a Node.js app, whereas my back-end transaction processing engine is better written as a Java application. So rather than trying to write everything in one language, I can now start breaking out large chunks of my application, write them in a more appropriate language. For example, Node.js being evented, Java being effectively process-driven. We can change how those applications interact with each other through APIs rather than through internal communications processes, and I can start changing the languages that I'm using for those different components if that's appropriate. So there are certainly benefits to going the microservices path. I am certainly not trying to say that that's the wrong approach, but in most cases, I don't think it's the thing that you need to do in order to move your application into the cloud. Maybe once you've moved the application into the cloud and you get a little bit of acceleration in terms of how you're able to deploy and upgrade that process, now you can start looking at how you start breaking the application apart into microservices because you've already got a model for trying an upgrade and reverting to a downgraded model if the upgrade didn't work. And so if I build now from one application two processes instead of one, I can say my upgrade includes deploying both processes and making sure that they work. And if they don't, I can remove the two processes and go back to the single previous process still. So even that sort of model is actually very powerful. It's part of the cloud automation model and mindset for dealing with these resources. And that to me is the real benefit of going to microservice architecture in the future. Not so much microservices, but the mindset around the application deployment process for microservices is the thing I think we want to take away in our environments. Well, folks, thanks for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to like it. Hit that thumbs up button. We always like to know that we're doing a good job. Don't forget to share this with your friends. And just to make sure that you get the latest and greatest episodes that we release, hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit the little bell next to it so that you actually can get notified when they come out. Thanks so much for joining us.